Well, welcome back to our study on Ruth, and we're going to go ahead and pick up our story where we left off last week. Last week we talked about the first 5 verses kind of setting the stage for one of the greatest love stories in all of literature, but it hasn't gotten off to the best start. And we're going to look today how this mosaic of God's sovereignty can take us from bitter to hope. In the first chapter, verses 6 through 22. Now, I want to start by saying that we all have messy lives. No matter how hard we work to put our best foot forward, if we're honest, we don't have it as together as we portray when we're out, or especially on any social media feed that we may own. Now, I'm not trying to be a downer. I'm just a realist. And when we look at the story of Ruth, we can see just how one simple action, Elimelech choosing to move to Moab, can create a mess bigger than we thought. Maybe we've been in a similar situation. Choices we've made that lead us deeper down into the pit. How many of us, when we face these messes, whether directly created by ourselves or various other circumstances, start an introspective look at ourselves, wondering where we went wrong and what sin we did led to this punishment? When we left off in the book of Ruth last week, it was a bit of a downer. 3 women, all widowed, a mess. One of the greatest love stories in the canon of literature has not gotten off to the best start. Yet we must be reminded that through the messes, a beautiful mosaic is being created by God. It reminds me a lot of 1 Peter 1, 3 through 10, where Peter says that according to his great mercy, he's caused us to be born again to a living hope. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, that perishes though it is tested by fire, may result in the glory and honor of Jesus Christ. The verse in Peter reminds us that those various trials, the messes that we face, serve a bigger purpose. Now, messes in our lives a lot of times can create for us introspection. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But, as Peter reminds us, for the Christian, these messes should point us to Jesus and the mosaic that he's creating through his sovereignty and through God's sovereignty that produce in us a hope. And that hope is something that we're actually going to see today in the book of Ruth as we look at the second part of chapter 1. And we call this From Bitter to Hope, because that's what's taking place in this story. So we're going to pick up in verses 6 and 7 to start off, and we're going to look at first the provision that God provides for Naomi and potentially her 2 daughter-in-laws. The author writes this. He says, "Then she, Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food." Right off the bat, right after we've ended verse 5, where Naomi is left without her sons, without her husband, in a foreign land of Moab that are traditional rivals to Israel. We know that she's been there for at least 10 years. And we hear in these first couple of verses that she is in the field. So she is doing whatever she can to survive in a foreign land. But yet while she's in this land, she hears that the Lord, the first mention of Yahweh, actively working in this story, has visited his people in Bethlehem, where she is from, the house of bread, and he has given them food. So that famine that was so integral to the story in the first part of Ruth, has now been lifted. And now God is providing again for his people. Now, the author doesn't tell us why he's providing again. He doesn't say that they got their hearts right or they stopped doing what was right in their own eyes. But we know that in this moment, God is working to provide for his people. And Naomi, being part of that lineage, understands that there's an opportunity for me to partake again in God's provision. My husband has led bad. He has not led well in bringing me and my family to Moab, and that has led to his death, and it has also led to my being widowed. But now God is working again. God's sovereignty is piecing together a mosaic, and Naomi has a choice to make. And what she does is she turns to her daughters-in-law, and she gives them a request. We can see in this moment Naomi's request to her daughters-in-law coming from a mother's heart. And so in verses 6 through 14, we see the request that she makes to Orpah and to Ruth. The author writes, "But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, 'Go each of you into your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband.' Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and they wept. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.' They lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." You can see the heart of Naomi in this moment, asking and begging essentially for God to deal kindly with her two daughters-in-law. But it also clues us into this inner working as well of God in this story and his sovereignty beautifully placing these pieces together. We know that Naomi's husband has died. We also know that Orpah and Ruth's husbands have died. And in this household lives an Israelite woman with two Moabite women. There is no grandchildren for Naomi, which in and of itself in ancient Israel is a type of curse. This discontinuation of the family line is seen as a curse in ancient times. There's no one to carry on the family name. And Naomi even mentions this to her daughter-in-law. She says, "Go back to your people and live your lives, because I have nothing for you." She even says that the Lord, the Almighty, has dealt bitterly with me. And she lays out a logical case. She says, "I'm too old to have a husband. And if I were to have hope and to have a husband and were to conceive by that husband, would you wait the necessary time and refrain from marrying so that he could bear you a child?" See, what's being referenced here is this marriage that would take place between a family member of a deceased husband and his wife. They would then conceive a son in order to carry on the dead husband's lineage. But Naomi can't offer this to Ruth or Orpah. She can't offer to them the ability to carry on this family line. And it speaks even deeper to the sovereignty of God in this story, because we know from chapter 1 that Ruth and Orpah were married to Mahlon and Chilion for at least a decade. In chapter 1, in the first 5 verses, the author tells us that 10 years had passed. And in that 10 years, that Orpah and Ruth married Mahlon and Chilion. So the sovereignty of God in this story has legitimately closed the wombs of these 2 women, and they did not produce children that would carry on the line. And now Naomi is advanced in age, and she cannot produce an heir that would then be able to marry Orpah or Ruth and carry on the family line. You can sense why Naomi feels so bitter. She doesn't know why God is dealing with her in this way, but yet these societal and cultural type curses seem to have been heaped upon her. It's a desperate situation. You can feel almost the emotion and the anguish with which Naomi speaks to her 2 daughter-in-laws in these verses. And she requests, she says, listen, I've got nothing to offer you. Go back home. Go find husbands in Moab and live out your lives and fulfill your duty as a wife, culturally at that time, to them. Go. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem because the Lord has provided food there. You go back to your people. And at first the 2 daughter-in-laws, they're like, no, we will go with you to your people, and we will go with you to your land. But Naomi again requests and says, I have nothing. Go. And it says that they wept. And Orpah stood, and Orpah kissed Naomi. And the implication is that she heeded the advice, and she left. But the author introduces us to Ruth by saying, but Ruth clung to her. This is the moment where the trajectory changes in the story. Now, Naomi's still going to feel what she feels. God has dealt with her bitterly, and we're going to get to that at the end of this chapter. But this moment right here, but Ruth clung to her. It's a huge, huge, huge moment in this story. And we pick up in the last half of verse 14 all the way to verse 21, and this is what the author records for us. He says, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back, Naomi said this, to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said to her, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. You can sense in this moment the shifting of the narrative a little bit. Ruth has the opportunity that Orpah had to leave Naomi, to stay in Moab, to marry a Moabite man and carry on with her life. And it would have been no harm, no foul. But that wasn't the way that God was orchestrating the story. When we read this word that Ruth clung to Naomi, what we're reading here is the exact same word from Genesis 2:24, where it says that a man shall leave his father and mother and shall marry a woman. It's the same picture. It's the same story and the same kind of feeling that this idea of being clung is being united to. In this moment, Ruth is being united to Naomi. And we have probably become very familiar with this passage of scripture, and maybe it was even said at your own wedding ceremony, but she says, where you go, I'm going to, and your people will be my people, and your God, Yahweh, will be my God. Ruth in this moment is experiencing God's redemption and conversion. She has now repented essentially of the worship of Chemosh that existed in Moab. And she says, Chemosh is no longer my God, but your God, Yahweh, Naomi, that is now my God. And I'm going with you. Now, there's no indication here that there was any type of discipleship going on. But what is being kind of implied through this text is Ruth saw the example that Naomi set. And there was some type of spiritual conversation, or there had to be some type of practice that was occurring in this household that would introduce Ruth to Yahweh so that she even knew who he was. But also in this moment, we see the hand of God reaching down and saving Ruth, giving her the opportunity to be part of the bigger story. See, this mosaic is being created. We have imperfect people, a woman born into a sinful country, much like we discussed last week, where we are born into sin ourselves, but yet the hand of God working and piecing together this mosaic says, nope, you are mine. And she makes the declaration and says, your God is my God. And in this moment, we have this beautiful picture of redemption. And Naomi at that point goes, okay, where I go, you'll go. My God's your God. My people are your people. Okay. And she no longer asks her to leave. And we get to verse 22 where they return to Bethlehem. And this is what the author says in verse 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? And Naomi said to them, don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full over a decade ago, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? I laugh when I read these verses because it seems as though Naomi, as introspective as she has been, and it is unfair what has happened to her, but the situation and the circumstances that have been created has led her to talk to her former country people, the women of Israel, of Bethlehem specifically. And they're like, is this Naomi? The one who left 10 years ago when her husband took him away to Moab? And Naomi goes, I was Naomi when I went away full. But now I come back and don't call me Naomi. Call me bitter. Because I am bitter. Because I feel as if the hand of God is oppressing me and has taken away everything that I once had. I don't know why this calamity has been brought upon me, but call me bitter. Now, what's not mentioned in these verses, but kind of an adjacent storyline is, we have to imagine that when Naomi enters Bethlehem and these women approach her and she goes through the whole, I'm not Naomi, I'm bitter, blah, 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 that Ruth is standing next to her. And these women would have recognized the foreigner. So not only is Naomi coming back empty, but she's also coming back with a rival of Israel. A woman of her household that's been married into her household that is not, as far as they know, a person of God. And if you read in Scripture, you'll understand that there was actually a prohibition against Moabites entering into the temple of God for 10 generations. So now we have an entire different situation being brought up where Ruth, in this declaration that she's just made a few verses previously, is now going to have to deal with the societal outcasting of herself. And how is God going to work through that? It's one of those situations where, as believers in God and as somebody who trusts in the sovereignty and provision of God, where we have to look at a situation and be like, okay, what's happening next? What do we do? Where do we go? What happens? Well, I told you that through the messes, there is hope. And in verse 22 of chapter 1, the end of the chapter, we already have said that this trajectory of this story has already changed because Ruth has said, no, I'm clinging to you. And we know that God has visited Bethlehem, but we see the hope that is created in this story in verse 22, where it says this: so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, still distinguishing her foreignness, her daughter-in-law, returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem, the house of bread, at the beginning of the barley harvest. God's provision is taking over in Bethlehem. He has visited Bethlehem and he has provided food again for his people. The house of bread that was empty is now being filled back up. And so Naomi, this financial need that we talked about last week, right? She has a need for finances. She has a need for family. Both of these have been discussed. Right now, the need financially, the provision, is taking a turn. This barley harvest is beginning. There's going to be food available to survive. And it's going to be on Naomi and Ruth to make sure that they are partaking in the provisions that God has provided. And we'll pick up on that in our next session.